salah. Horas ni amat biskat matiam.
Ave Maria, Maria Tuhan, Tuhan dia kita roh Yesus dia.
Santa Maria merawat ni, merawat kami kena salah. Horas ni amat biskat matiam.
Maria seperti Tuhan merawat kami.
My own family, that is the direct family, with altogether 15 of us. And out of these 15, only 3 of us left.
My oldest brother was poisoned by Indonesian intelligence. I lost 2 oldest brothers, 1 brother-in-law, and 3 sons.
My brothers killed and executed in front of my eyes by the Indonesian military.
East Timor is a tiny country just 400 miles to the north of Australia. A Portuguese colony for more than 400 years, East Timor was invaded in 1975 by Indonesia, the 5th largest nation in the world, led by a military dictatorship. Indonesia has no historical nor legal claim to East Timor, yet its brutal occupation has met with mostly silence from the world's leading governments and international agencies.
What happened here 18 years ago happened mostly in secret, and this filming is being done in secret without the approval or knowledge of the Indonesian authorities. Journalists and independent observers are not welcome in East Timor. 2 Australian television teams, including 2 Britons, were murdered here in 1975 by the Indonesian army for trying to breach the wall of silence that the regime in Jakarta and its Western allies had built around East Timor. As a result of the Indonesian invasion and occupation, some 200,000 people died here. That's a third of the population, or proportionately more than were killed in Cambodia under Pol Pot. They were killed resisting the invasion, they were murdered without reason, they died in concentration camps, and they starved. Perhaps genocide is too often used these days, but by any standards, that's what's happened here. And it happened mostly beyond the reach of the TV camera and the satellite dish, and with the connivance and complicity of Western governments, the same governments that were prepared to go to war against Saddam Hussein, but were not prepared in almost parallel circumstances to stop a rapacious invader that had broken every provision in the United Nations Charter and had defied no less than 10 United Nations sanctioning resolutions calling on it to withdraw from East Timor. We should keep our heads down, said a British ambassador to Indonesia, and let matters take their course. Letting matters take their course, the governments of Britain, the United States, Australia, and others supplied the means by which the regime in Jakarta has bled East Timor. This film is the story of that bleeding and of a cover-up that tells us much about the selectivity and aims of great power and how the modern world is ordered.
Que os indonésios vão fazendo para acabar com o povo timorense de uma forma ou de outra. Terror que vai matando as pessoas. Se não vier ajuda, se o mundo internacional não se interessar em nós, seremos esmagados pela Indonésia. Culturalmente, estamos moralmente e fisicamente.
My responsibility is to my own people and to my own constituents. And I don't really fill my mind much with what one set of foreigners is doing to another. One has to say, what is it that's so dreadfully special about East Timor to the people here?
On 13 December 1983, the military took my brothers and killed in front of my eyes. And they pull out, after they kill, they pull out their heart and show to us that's a dirty heart. Now you must agree the integration.
Indonesian government has played a strategy of not allowing people to go into East Timor. No tourists, no cameras, no journalists were allowed in. But the people of East Timor themselves have suffered so much that you can see it through their eyes. There is a fear. All the eyes says it all. You don't have to talk to the people of East Timor. Even the little children shows in their eyes, in their face, that they never smile. There's not one single family that has not lost a member of their family. They always have a story to say in terms of women being raped or a young boy would be just snatched from his house and never been able to see it again. And this kind of torture has constantly happened, and it is on a daily basis.
Timor is a land of crosses, crosses etched against the sky, crosses on peaks, crosses on hillsides. This is the grave of just one family, all killed on the same day.
The people in East Timor themselves call it, and we call it, the biggest prison island in the world. That is what it is. It's a hell.
Can you give me an idea of what it was like to grow up in East Timor in those years before the invasion?
Well, it was typical island life in which people live very happily, in a friendly, people go about their business without worrying about authorities or guns. Even though we were ruled by a foreign power, which was Portuguese then, but Portuguese very much left people alone in traditional lives. They didn't do what Indonesia have done in the last 18 years.
Not once, ever, in all my adult life, I witnessed a racial incident. So East Timor was, in fact, under the Portuguese, was a relatively happy country. The Portuguese also had a benign attitude towards the East Timorese. You might describe it benign neglect. I would say they treated the people reasonably. They never interfere with the people in the mountains. Not so much, maybe out of his intellectual, anthropological understanding of native culture, but largely because of the Portuguese very Mediterranean laziness, neglect, laissez-faire. So the people were quite happy in the mountains.
So it is clear, Mr. President, that we have common interests, that the partnership between Britain and Indonesia is also shaped by common values. Your visit is an opportunity for us to develop all aspects of our relationship, from trade and investment to areas such as climate change and education, as well as foreign policy and international security, where we share common values on the global stage as we work together in the international community to build the momentum for peace.
I was always insulted. They spat in my face, and they'd get a gun and pointing it at my head and in front of my children. They'd ask me, as they were pointing the gun at my head, how I'd feel if these two little children disappeared.
os miúdos. E quando eles se referiam a isso,
And when they said that,
punha mais
I burst into tears,
com pena
with grief for my children, but more
por ódio
out of hatred at finding myself powerless to do anything about what they were doing.
entravam e saíam à minha casa, faziam como se fosse um próprio comando. Até ao ponto
They came and went from my house and acted as if they were the rightful owners,
aceitaram a imposição
to the extent that
para viver com
I was forced to live with one of their collaborators,
vida essa que foi para mim
a life which was
muito difícil
very difficult
e com muito
and extremely offensive for me
porque isso
because of the humiliation that I felt for all women and for my own husband.
mas dentro
But inside I always felt
aquele orgulho que também
that pride that I too was a woman and that I too was suffering like so many others
tudo isso pelo
for the love of our country and our children.
By 1977, the Indonesian foreign minister acknowledged that up to 80,000 East Timorese might have died under their military occupation. Independent reports corroborated the use of napalm and chemical sprays, as well as bombing, food deprivation, deportation, and summary execution. After 3 years in the mountains, Ermelinda and Leonardo Araujo were starved out of their village by the Indonesians.
First of all, they shot my husband and he fell to the ground. I didn't see this because I was facing the other way. My grandson was quivering. He stood up very still and saw his grandfather lying motionless on the ground. He began to cry. All of the children were crying. The children were crying. Grandpa, get up, get up. Grandpa is dead.
Here lies the ruins of the Portuguese Empire in Timor. The Indonesian regime has sought to justify its occupation of this country on grounds of what it calls common brotherhood. In fact, the East Timorese have virtually nothing in common with Indonesia. They have a different language and culture, and whereas Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, the East Timorese are Catholic and animist. Even their colonial experience was different, with the Portuguese Latinizing East Timor and setting it distinctly apart from the experiences of the Dutch colonies that became Indonesia. Of course, some things never change, like the propaganda of naked aggression. When the Germans overran and occupied most of Europe, they too used the term common brotherhood.
This was Indonesia in the mid-1960s. Books were burned and popular democracy crushed when General Suharto came to power. In the West, Indonesia was seen as an investor's paradise, a huge market, rich in oil and other natural resources. Richard Nixon called Indonesia the greatest prize in Southeast Asia. Suharto and his generals were welcome to the free world.
The Americans persuaded the Indonesians to delay the invasion until after the president had left. And on December the 7th, as the presidential jet climbed out of Indonesian airspace, the bloodbath began.
people are being killed, I repeat, indiscriminately.
The first days, hundreds and hundreds of people were simply massacred upon the Indonesian troop arrival in Dili.
Ela foi morta com bombardeamento que os indonésios atacaram aquela zona dos Malais, intenso bombardeamento, então foi este estilhaço que matou a minha filha com 21 anos. E muito mais gente, feridos, mortos com bombardeamento dos indonésios.
These are the hulks of Indonesian landing craft, left as stark reminders to the population on the beach in the center of Dili. When the Indonesians landed here, they began an operation that has been compared in its savagery with Pol Pot's takeover of Cambodia. Hundreds of people were gunned down in the streets, in schools, in shops, in their homes, in the hospital. Live grenades were thrown into houses. Women and girls were raped in front of their families. The Indonesian troops had been told that the East Timorese were communists and primitives who threatened the very existence of Indonesia itself. The strategy was clearly to terrorize an entire nation.
We were learning about it from hard, firm reports from people on the scene in East Timor. Reports of people being herded into school buildings by Indonesian soldiers with the buildings set on fire, and anyone trying to get out being shot, but most of the people being burned alive. People being herded into fields and machine gunned. People being hunted down in the mountains, so anyone out there was in what amounted to a free fire zone.
There was also a systematic pattern to the terror. To many Timorese, their glistening ocean is still known as the Sea of Blood. People were brought here to die in groups, and as in Cambodia, often the first to die were the educated, public officials, teachers, students, nurses. One eyewitness reported the words of an Indonesian officer who, when asked to justify the mass killing of women and children, said, "When you clean the fields, don't you kill all the snakes, both large and small?"
Out of our clan, which at that time in '74, as I know it, as I knew then, was out of 5,000, and the number have reduced to about over 500.
From 5,000 to
yes,
500?
Yes. It's very, very reduced.
That's extraordinary slaughter of
It is,
people.
it is. And there was a massive, massive bombardment that took place. People even said that the whole rocks become white because all the trees and grass that grow on the rocks were all blown up.
In 1981, the Indonesian military force-marched tens of thousands of people at gunpoint in human chains across the island. This was known as the Fence of Legs. The aim was to flush out Fretland guerrillas, with Indonesian troops following on behind and pursuing them into human corrals where they could be captured or killed. Thousands of civilians died in the operation, including children and old people.
Durante a operação de limpeza, o que se via que as pessoas mortas, já, tanto os corpos, os cadáveres já tinham uma outra forma, que se não podia saber como é que eles mataram e por que eles mataram. O que é certo que os guerrilheiros, segundo algumas fotografias que os próprios comandantes tiraram, fotografaram, e que foram mortos, alguns foram mortos a facada, foram torturados aos poucos até morrerem, alguns foram decapitados e colados, e alguns foram atados e cortados aos pedaços e até castrados, e até mulheres foram violadas à frente dos maridos.
For almost 2 years following the invasion, there was virtually a news blackout over events in East Timor. Then 2 nuns in Portugal received this letter from a priest in East Timor. The invaders, he wrote, have intensified their attacks in the 3 classic ways, from land, sea and air. The bombers do not stop. Hundreds die every day. The bodies of the victims become food for carnivorous birds. Villages have been completely destroyed. The barbarities understandable in the Middle Ages, justifiable in the Stone Age, are an organized evil that has spread deep roots in East Timor. The terror of arbitrary imprisonment is our daily bread. I am on the persona non grata list, and any day I could disappear. Fretland soldiers who give themselves up are disposed of. For them, there is no prison. Genocide will come soon.
On the top of the mountain was a space. Was there many of bones on the top of each other? And Jose said, "Oh, please pray, Fatima. This is our families. Part of our family died here. Was a massacre here, and it's not bones from animals. They are our family."
So you'd come across the bones of people who belong to your family.
That's right.
How
yes.
many people were there? How many? The bones of how many people?
Oh my God, that was many. I believe that about 50 people.
We drove through what the Indonesians call military control areas, where people were forcibly moved as a means of separating them from the resistance. The dislocation caused by camps like this has struck at the very roots of Timorese society. People are subjected to a form of brainwashing that extols Suharto's new order, and in schools all over East Timor, the Timorese language is banned, while immigrants are brought from Indonesia to run the island's economy and to further dilute the Timorese population.
When you move people away from their sacred land, away from places where they live for thousands of years, into lower areas infested by mosquito, they are not able to move out of those camps to cultivate, for instance. There is a curfew, and because they cannot cultivate, there is no food. And there is no food, they die.
In the late 1970s and early 80s, famine claimed many thousands of lives in resettlement camps where people were denied adequate land to grow food. Although we saw no starvation, a great many people were terribly malnourished. While the massacres continued, the agents of great power worked hard to maintain the silence. In January 1976, the American ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Moynihan, sent a secret cable to Henry Kissinger boasting of the considerable progress he was making in blocking UN action on East Timor. Later, Moynihan wrote, "The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective. This task was given to me, and I carried it through with no inconsiderable success." These are Hawk ground attack aircraft, made by British Aerospace, and one of the fastest-selling British weapons in the world. In 1978, at the height of the genocide, David Owen, Foreign Secretary in the Labour government, agreed to sell the Hawk to Indonesia. From then on, the British establishment played court to the Suharto regime, while selling it more Hawk aircraft, more missiles, helicopters, frigates, armoured vehicles, mine disposal equipment, military communications, and a fully equipped Institute of Technology for the Indonesian Army, Margaret Thatcher received an award for the promotion of technology. She told her Indonesian audience, "I am proud to be one of you." In 1991, the government of John Major urged its European partners to cut aid to regimes that violated human rights. In the same year, Major shook hands with Indonesia's weapons chief, B.J. Habibie. Later, the government announced a £1 billion deal for more Hawk aircraft, despite the devastation they were causing.
Flamboyant in the old Portuguese resort town of Bacau, where official visitors were often brought to admire the peacefulness of East Timor under Indonesian rule. What they weren't told, of course, was that the Hotel Flamboyant was used by the military as a torture place. There is extensive official documentation describing how Indonesian soldiers were taught to dress and behave as civilians, pretending to be Timorese whose language they didn't speak, even playing the part of happy, uncomplaining prisoners in comfortable prisons that, of course, didn't exist. There are also documents showing that torture was officially sanctioned with established procedures for the torturer. One such manual is entitled Guiding the Village Comprehensively and lists the do's and don'ts of torture. And here they are. Avoid taking photographs showing torture in progress and when people are being subjected to electric current and when they are being stripped naked, etc. Remember not to have photographs developed outside East Timor, which could then be made available to the public by irresponsible elements. Interrogation should be repeated over and over again until the correct conclusion is drawn.
Jose Amarin, now in exile, was forced as a boy to watch his father being tortured.
I was asked to come in order, all of us, to see my father the time when he was tortured. And then he was tortured by Indonesian. We are looking at the action and we are warned by the Indonesians that, look, if you kids, for the coming time being, you follow the example of your father, you are against the Indonesians, you will have the same sort like your father.
What did they do to your father?
They tortured him for several times.
What did they do?
They punched him and beaten him and put their fingers to manipulate the stomach and intestines of my father, because usually the Indonesian troops are trained with, they call silat or karate, and they are used usually to this kind of torture. And they put their fingers to the stomach of my father and starting, how can I say in English, like this.
These are rare pictures of Fretilin guerrillas still fighting on after 18 years. We filmed them under the noses of the Indonesian army, which claims to control all of East Timor. They get no outside help from any government. All their weapons are captured from the Indonesians. Some have not seen their families for years, and every man here has lost members of his family. Delphine became a guerrilla after witnessing one of the most notorious massacres.
As populações começaram a voltar na vida e os javas mataram todos os homens, os velhos e os juventudes ali na Ribeira de Betu. São 66 pessoas. vive, ainda está vive junto de nós no mato e já rendeu outra vez, entrou outra vez na vida.
E as mulheres, o que aconteceu com elas?
E as mulheres foram perseguidas pelos javas e violadas e foram massacrados e mataram tantas.
The village of Kararis used to be here until it was razed to the ground by the Indonesians.
That is the village that in 1983, more or less 400 of population, 400 of population were killed by Indonesian troops.
They were all buried here in a mass grave.
There is no any cross. They put only the stone and bamboos because population afraid that when they put a cross here or a mark here, Indonesian troop will arrest the person who put cross here.
This is an extraordinary list of almost 300 of those murdered in this one village during the summer of 1983. It is evidence of a crime against humanity, reminiscent of the Nazis in occupied Europe. The list was compiled by the Church in a meticulous handwritten script that records the name, age, date, and place of every death of every victim, as well as the Indonesian battalion responsible for each murder. Note the ages and how young they are, and the names of whole families. The women who survived were brought here to what is known as the village of the widows. Another form of population control is contraception, given without the permission or knowledge of women, especially the enforced use of the contraceptive drug Depo-Provera.
People are forced to have Depo-Provera injections. For example, there were schoolgirls, teenagers, who were injected with Depo-Provera so that they don't have babies anymore. And what they were told was that there was some kind of anti-tetanus injection.
This doctor went to East Timor on our behalf and secretly investigated the use of enforced birth control.
Well, I found in one clinic a very large number of people were being given birth control, I think out of all proportion to the other efforts that were being made, medical efforts that were being made. And I heard many people say that the birth control injection was being given without any explanation to the people who were receiving it.